The metallic clang of handcuffs echoed down the polished marble hallway, a cruel symphony of humiliation. Each forced step of the frail woman, her gray hair framing faded blue eyes, was accompanied by the jingle of the chains binding her delicate wrists. She walked with a dignity born only of surviving decades of injustice, her spine straight, her chin held high, her lips pressed into a firm line guarding stories the world would never fully know. Around her, diplomats in dark suits and impeccable ties averted their gazes, whispering amongst themselves in various languages, their voices laced with barely concealed discomfort. The grand hall of the International Conference Center, with its flags waving under artificial lights and red carpets that had witnessed decades of agreements and treaties, had never seen anything like this. Anna Petrova, that was the name on the official documents, though few could pronounce it correctly, had dedicated 40 years of her life to silent diplomacy, translating not only words but intentions, fears, and hopes between nations that often hated each other. Her hands, now shackled, had held peace treaties, ceasefire documents, and agreements that had saved thousands of lives. The almost imperceptible scars on her fingers told a story of late nights typing urgent proposals, of pens slipping due to nervous sweat during tense negotiations, of sharp papers handled hastily when diplomacy raced against time. Now those same hands were bound by cold metal, accused of treason by a regime that had changed the rules of the game mid-play. The accusation was as absurd as it was devastating, leaking classified information to a foreign power. Anna knew it was a lie, as did everyone who truly knew her. But the new government needed a scapegoat for its own diplomatic failures, and an elderly woman without influential family to defend her seemed the perfect target. There were rumors she would be sent to a military prison in hostile territory, a fate that in practice was a disguised death sentence. The guards flanking her were young, likely born after Anna had already begun her career. They avoided her gaze, carrying out orders that clearly disturbed them. One, with a wispy mustache and trembling hands, had mumbled an almost inaudible sorry as he fastened the cuffs. The other, taller and broad-shouldered, kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if focusing on a distant point could lessen the shame he felt. Anna's fate on that October morning was no secret to anyone in the building. In less than an hour she would be transferred to a military vehicle that would take her far from everything she knew. There would be no fair trial, no defense, no witnesses, only the gradual disappearance of a woman who knew too much about the failings of powerful men. As she walked down the endless corridor, Anna allowed herself one last contemplation of the faces around her. She recognized some ambassadors she had worked with, advisors who sought her out in moments of crisis, younger translators who saw her as a mentor. All averted their gaze, trapped in their own webs of political self-preservation. She didn't judge them, she understood perfectly the weight of the consequences each would face if they dared to interfere. But there was something different that morning, an almost imperceptible energy hanging in the air like electricity before a storm. Anna noticed unusual movement near the large oak doors of the main hall. Advisors scurried discreetly to and fro, phones rang with unusual insistence, and there was a restrained agitation that contrasted with the forced solemnity of her public walk of shame. The first sign that something was changing came in the form of hurried footsteps echoing from the adjacent corridor. Anna slightly turned her head, as much as the chains allowed, and saw a middle-aged man running toward the group, his phone still glued to his ear, his face flushed with exhaustion and what seemed to be suppressed panic. It was Marcus, the chief of protocol, someone Anna had known for 2 decades, and who had always maintained an impeccably calm demeanor, even in the most tense situations. "Stop!" Marcus yelled, his voice echoing through the marble walls with an urgency that made everyone present turn towards him. The guards hesitated, looking at each other with clear confusion. Marcus approached, breathless, and whispered something in the ear of the taller guard. Anna saw the blood drain from the young soldier's face, who immediately slowed his pace and looked at her with an expression that mixed astonishment and something close to terror. It was then that Anna heard, or rather felt, the shift in the atmosphere. The constant murmur of diplomatic conversations had ceased abruptly, replaced by a tense and expectant silence. Firm and determined footsteps echoed down the main corridor, accompanied by the distinctive sound of military boots marching in perfect synchronization. These were not the hesitant steps of young soldiers following orders they questioned internally. It was the sound of true authority approaching. Anna knew that sound. She had grown up hearing it on the streets of her hometown. During the years of occupation, she had learned to distinguish between the different kinds of authority different boots carried. These were not boots of oppression, they were boots of liberation, of justice, of someone unafraid to confront power when necessary. The figure that emerged from the side corridor was imposing without being intimidating, commanding respect without demanding submission. Admiral Thompson, that was the name discreetly embroidered on his uniform, was a man in his 60s, with perfectly cropped gray hair and blue eyes that seemed capable of seeing through the most elaborate lies. His decorations weren't ostentatious, but Anna recognized several medals awarded only to those who had sacrificed much in the name of world peace. What struck one most about Thompson wasn't his rank or military achievements, but the aura of moral integrity that emanated from his presence. He was the kind of man Anna had met few times in her career, someone who saw diplomacy not as a power game, but as a sacred responsibility to humanity. His hands, slightly calloused from military work, told stories of conflicts resolved through negotiation rather than violence, of bridges built where others saw only insurmountable chasms. Thompson stopped 10 feet from Anna, his eyes quickly scanning the scene before him, the dignified woman in chains, the clearly uncomfortable guards, the diplomats beginning to cluster at the edges of the hallway, drawn in by the sudden shift in atmosphere. For a moment that felt like an eternity, he simply observed, his expression revealing a mixture of controlled indignation and profound sadness. Dear reader, if this story is touching your heart as it's touching mine as I share it, I'd like to make a special request. Subscribe to our channel and turn on post notifications, not just to receive more narratives like this, but because I deeply believe that stories of dignity and courage need to be amplified in a world that often celebrates the opposite. Each subscription is a vote for humanity, for hope, for the belief that there are still people willing to make a difference. By subscribing, you not only support our work, but you join a community of souls who still believe in the transformative power of compassion. And the bell? Well, it ensures you never miss a story that can inspire not only you, but someone you decide to share it with. Because stories like Anna's deserve to be told and retold, until the world remembers that human dignity is non-negotiable. Remove the restraints, Thompson finally said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of moral authority. It wasn't a request, it was an order delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who knows it will be obeyed. The guards nervously glanced at each other, clearly torn between the orders they'd received from their immediate superiors and the unquestionable authority of the man before them. Sir, began the taller guard, his voice faltering slightly, our orders are specific. We can't. Your orders, Thompson interrupted smoothly, were rescinded 15 minutes ago by an authority higher than the one who originally issued them. He extended an official document that Anna couldn't clearly see, but which caused an immediate reaction in the soldiers. Miss Petrova is under international diplomatic protection. Any action against her now constitutes a direct violation of treaties your own government signed. The ensuing silence was deafening. Anna felt her legs tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden relief of someone who had mentally prepared for death and suddenly found herself returned to life. She watched as the guard with the thin mustache unlocked the handcuffs with visibly trembling hands, muttering apologies she knew to be sincere. When the cold metal finally came away from her wrists, Anna slowly raised her hands, examining the red marks left by the cuffs as if they were symbols of a battle won. She gently massaged her wrists, a gesture so simple and human that it broke the spell of tension that had dominated the hallway. Thompson took another step closer, his eyes meeting Anna's for the first time. What she saw there wasn't pity. Anna had learned to despise pity, but recognition. It was the look of someone who understood the weight of the injustice suffered, and the value of dignity maintained under extreme pressure. Miss Petrova, he said, his voice softer now, imbued with a respect Anna hadn't heard in months, on behalf of the international community and all those who value dedicated service to peace, I apologize for the undignified treatment you have suffered." He paused, allowing his words to echo through the hallway, now crowded with diplomats and officials who had gathered to witness this historic moment. Furthermore, Thompson continued, "I'd like to inform you that your contribution to the resolution of the Balkan conflict in 1995 was officially recognized yesterday by the Security Council. The translation you did of the ceasefire document, the one everyone thought was lost, was found in the archives and confirmed as the decisive factor that prevented an escalation that could have cost thousands of lives." Anna felt tears forming in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall, not yet. The mention of that document brought back memories of a terrible night when she had worked for 16 hours straight, translating linguistic nuances so subtle that a misinterpretation could have restarted hostilities that had taken years to suspend. She had never known if her work had actually been used, if her carefully chosen words had made a difference. "There's more," Thompson said, and Anna detected something close to a smile in his stern expression. "The government that ordered your arrest has been informed that any action against you would be interpreted as hostility against the international alliance. They dropped all charges an hour ago." The hallway erupted in murmurs and whispers. Anna saw familiar faces emerging from the crowd, fellow diplomats who now approached timidly, some with tears in their eyes, others with shy smiles of relief. Marie, the young French translator Anna had mentored, pushed her way through the crowd and impulsively embraced her, whispering, "Thank you for never giving up," in French broken by emotion. But it was Thompson's subsequent gesture that etched that moment into the memory of everyone present forever. The Admiral, a man accustomed to being saluted and revered wherever he went, bowed slightly to Anna, not a formal bow, but a salute of equals, from someone who recognized in another a comparable dedication to the service of humanity. "True strength," he said, his voice carrying clearly so that all could hear, "lies not in those who can arrest or accuse, but in those who maintain their dignity and purpose even when the whole world seems to have turned its back. You, Miss Petrova, represent the best of diplomacy, not because you never failed, but because you never stopped trying to build bridges where others saw only walls." Anna finally allowed a tear to roll down her cheek, followed by another and another. But these were not tears of sadness or relief. They were tears of recognition, of validation, of a life dedicated to service finally seen and valued by someone with the moral authority to do so. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost lost in emotion, "not for the apologies or the recognition, but for reminding me that there are still people willing to do the right thing even when it's difficult." Thompson nodded solemnly. "Courage, Miss Petrova, is contagious. You reminded us of that today." In the days that followed, the story of what happened in that marble hallway spread through international diplomatic circles like wildfire. It wasn't just the facts that were impressive, the last-minute intervention, the international authority mobilized in a few hours, justice prevailing over political expediency, but the way it all happened. Anna returned to work a week later, not because she needed the money, but because she had understood that her experience had become part of a larger lesson about dignity and resilience. Young diplomats from all over the world began to seek her out, not to learn translation techniques, but to understand how to remain principled in a world that often punishes integrity. Thompson never spoke publicly about his intervention. When questioned by reporters about the details of how he managed to mobilize international authority so quickly, he simply replied that justice has its own channels, and they work best when not exposed to the limelight. But those who knew him well knew that he had spent the entire night on the phone, calling in favors accumulated over decades of service, pressing contacts in embassies and ministries, using every ounce of influence he had earned to save a woman he had never met personally, but whose work he deeply respected. The most significant change, however, didn't happen in the corridors of power, but in the hearts of those who witnessed that moment. The young guards who had been forced to handcuff Anna never forgot the lesson about the difference between following orders and doing the right thing. Marcus, the chief of protocol, began to more actively question the orders he received, developing a courage he didn't know he possessed. Marie, the young translator, dedicated her career to ensuring that stories like Anna's would never be repeated, becoming a powerful voice in the defense of the rights of diplomatic professionals. But perhaps the deepest impact was on Anna herself. She discovered that the experience of almost losing everything had given her a new perspective on the value of her contribution to the world. The scars on her wrists, left by the handcuffs, became symbols not of humiliation, but of survival and resistance. She began to tell her story, not as a victim who suffered injustice, but as a professional who refused to be silenced by those who feared the truth. Months later, at an international conference on human rights, Anna was invited to speak about her experience. She walked onto the stage with the same dignity with which she had walked down that marble hallway, but now there was something different in her posture, a lightness, a freedom that came from having survived the worst that arbitrary power could do, and emerged even stronger. I learned, she told an audience of hundreds of diplomats, that the true prison is not the handcuffs on our wrists, but the fear in our hearts. When we stop being afraid to do the right thing, we discover that we have more allies than we imagine. There are people like Admiral Thompson everywhere. We just need to have enough courage to deserve their intervention. The audience rose to its feet, applauding not only Anna, but the idea that human dignity, once courageously defended, creates waves of inspiration that spread far beyond the initial moment of injustice. Thompson, watching from the back of the auditorium, smiled subtly and left before the applause ended. He had another flight to catch, another crisis to solve, another person to defend. That's how he operated, showing up when needed, making a difference, and disappearing without seeking recognition. But Anna saw him leaving. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the crowd, and she nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude, that he returned before disappearing out the door. Years later, when young diplomats asked Anna about that day, she always ended the story the same way. Heroism doesn't come with fanfare or spotlights. It comes in the form of people who choose to make a difference when it would be easier to look the other way. Admiral Thompson didn't just save me by removing handcuffs. He reminded me that there's still enough goodness in the world to be worth fighting for. The truth is, none of us know when we might be called upon to be someone else's Thompson. Maybe it's when we see someone unjustly accused at our workplace. Maybe it's when we witness discrimination on public transport. Maybe it's in much smaller, but no less important situations, a colleague being belittled, a neighbor being ostracized, a child being bullied. What Anna and Thompson teach us is that moral courage is a choice we make moment by moment, not a quality we're born with or without. It's the choice to see the humanity in each person, to recognize that our own dignity is connected to the dignity of those around us, to understand that silence in the face of injustice is a form of complicity. The restraints were removed from Anna's wrists that October day, but the real liberation happened when she realized she had never truly been a prisoner. Her dignity, her integrity, her commitment to truth, none of that could be handcuffed or taken away by force. Arbitrary power can control bodies, it can manipulate circumstances, it can even destroy lives, but it cannot touch the most essential part of who we are. And Thompson, he continued to be the quiet guardian of justice he always was, showing up in people's lives when they least expected it, but when they needed it most, not as a dramatic savior, but as a gentle reminder that the world still has people willing to do the right thing, especially when it's difficult. Anna and Thompson's story isn't extraordinary because events like these are rare. It's extraordinary because it reminds us that acts of moral courage happen every day, on small and large scales, performed by ordinary people who decide to be extraordinary when necessary. On the quiet nights that followed that day, Anna often touched the faded marks on her wrists and smiled. They had become symbols not of her imprisonment, but of her freedom, freedom to continue being who she always was, to continue building bridges, to continue believing that well-chosen words can prevent wars, and that human dignity is the only currency that truly matters in the end. And somewhere in the world, in another hallway, in another situation of injustice, there's another Thompson walking towards another Anna, ready to remove restraints that should never have been placed, ready to remind the world that humanity is still worth defending, because that's how hope survives, not in grand public gestures or grandiose pronouncements, but in quiet moments of courage, in people who choose to make a difference when it would be so much easier to simply walk on by. It's in stories like this that we learn that heroism doesn't wear a uniform, it wears compassion, dresses in courage, and walks in the shoes of those who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable.